Louisville, Kentucky, March 14, 2023. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in Crescent Hill, but instead, Amanda Turner, a 42-year-old nurse, was found unresponsive in her living room. Her husband, Eric, called 911, saying things had gotten out of hand during an argument. At first, it seemed like a terrible accident, but you know how these things go. When the investigators started digging, the story didn't quite add up. What happened to Amanda turned out to be more than just a tragic misunderstanding. It became a story about secrets, betrayal, and how even the best-looking marriages can hide some pretty dark stuff. Eric, the guy everyone thought was just a hard-working family man, suddenly found himself right in the middle of it all. So, how does something like this even happen? To figure that out, we've got to go back and take a good, hard look at their life together. The lies, the cracks in their relationship, and the choices that led to that night. Eric and Amanda Turner appeared to have it all. In their mid-40s, they had built a life many envied. Eric was a construction manager, a hard-working, reliable man known for his steady temperament and deep ties to the community. Amanda was a nurse at the University of Louisville Hospital, admired for her compassion and dedication to her patients. Together, they lived in a cozy brick home in Crescent Hill, a neighborhood that seemed like the perfect backdrop for their seemingly perfect life. But if you looked closer, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Over the past year, Amanda had been working more late nights, often coming home after midnight. She claimed the extra hours were to cover unexpected expenses, but the shift in her demeanor didn't sit right with Eric. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, was now always locked. Eric dismissed it at first, chalking it up to stress from her demanding job, but the little signs began piling up. One evening, Eric overheard Amanda talking softly on the phone. "I can't wait to see you again," she said, her voice filled with a tenderness that wasn't directed at him. His stomach dropped. He stood frozen outside the bedroom, straining to hear more, but Amanda quickly ended the call. The next day, Eric noticed a bouquet of roses in her car. When he asked about it, Amanda smiled casually. "A patient's family," she explained. "They were just grateful for my help." The answer seemed reasonable, but something about her tone left him uneasy. As weeks passed, Eric began noticing more discrepancies. Credit card statements revealed dinners at restaurants they hadn't visited together and charges he didn't recognize. Amanda brushed them off as work-related expenses, but Eric's suspicions deepened. Conversations between them grew tense, their once easy banter replaced by strained exchanges. Amanda seemed to be pulling away, and Eric didn't know why. The breaking point came when Eric found a receipt in Amanda's purse for a weekend trip to Chicago, a trip she had claimed was a work conference. The dates matched a weekend she had been unreachable, citing packed schedules and no time to call. Eric felt the ground shift beneath him. He needed answers. One Friday evening, he decided to follow her. Amanda had mentioned another late shift at the hospital, but Eric watched from his car as she drove past her usual route. She headed downtown, pulling into the parking lot of a dimly lit restaurant. Eric parked a block away, his heart pounding as he watched her step out of the car. Moments later, a man approached her, a man Eric didn't recognize. Tall, sharply dressed, with an air of confidence, the stranger greeted Amanda with a warm hug. They walked into the restaurant together, their laughter visible even from a distance. Eric stayed long enough to see them seated at a table by the window, leaning in close, completely at ease with each other. That night, Eric didn't confront her. Instead, he drove home and sat in the dark, replaying the scene in his mind. He couldn't bring himself to believe what he'd seen. The Amanda he thought he knew, the woman he'd built a life with, was slipping away. The next day, Eric hired a private investigator. Within 2 weeks, the PI confirmed his worst fears. Amanda was having an affair with Dr. Matthew Grant, a cardiologist at her hospital. The investigator's report was thorough, detailing late-night meetups, discreet dinners, and even a few afternoons spent at a luxury hotel downtown. It wasn't just a fling. They had been seeing each other for months. The investigator also uncovered something that stung even more: Dr. Grant's reputation. Known for his charm and polished demeanor, he had a history of seducing married women. Eric read the report over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. One evening, while Amanda was in the shower, Eric searched her purse again. This time, he found a second phone. When he powered it on, the messages between her and Grant left no room for doubt. They weren't just having an affair. They were making plans for the future. Eric's hands shook as he scrolled through the messages, each one feeling like a knife to the chest. When Amanda came out of the bathroom, Eric was waiting for her, holding the phone. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Amanda's face went pale. At first, she denied everything, but Eric pressed on, showing her the evidence. Cornered, she finally admitted to the affair, but insisted it was a mistake. "I was going to end it," she said, tears streaming down her face. But Amanda didn't stop there. She turned the blame on Eric. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice rising. "You've been so distant, so consumed with work. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." Eric couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So this is my fault?" he shot back. "You cheated, Amanda. You lied to me, and now you want to pin this on me?" The argument lasted for hours, their voices echoing through the house. Amanda eventually promised to break things off with Grant and work on their marriage. For a brief moment, Eric wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe they could fix this, that the woman he loved was still in there somewhere. For a few weeks, things seemed to improve. Amanda was more present, and their conversations felt less forced. But Eric's trust was shattered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. His suspicions were confirmed when he found another message from Grant on Amanda's hidden phone. The affair hadn't ended. It had simply gone underground. Amanda was still lying, and Eric felt like a fool for believing her. Consumed by anger and betrayal, Eric's behavior grew erratic. He began drinking heavily, his once steady demeanor replaced by a simmering rage. At work, he made careless mistakes, and his colleagues started to notice the change. Friends tried to intervene, but Eric pushed them away, unable to focus on anything but Amanda's betrayal. One night, Eric's best friend, Tom, sat him down. "You need to let this go," Tom said. "It's eating you alive, man. Walk away before it destroys you." But Eric couldn't let it go. He had given Amanda everything. His love, his loyalty, his life, and she had thrown it away. The betrayal felt like a weight he couldn't lift, and the thought of losing her to someone like Grant only made it heavier. The tension in their home reached a boiling point. Amanda started spending more nights away, claiming work obligations, while Eric spiraled deeper into obsession. He tracked her movements, scoured her belongings for clues, and replayed every argument in his mind. Their once happy home had become a battlefield, each of them caught in a cycle of blame and bitterness. Eric didn't know it yet, but they were heading toward a breaking point, one that would change their lives forever. Eric couldn't ignore the growing distance between himself and Amanda. The warmth they once shared had been replaced by tension and secrecy. Amanda spent more nights at work, her phone now locked and guarded like a secret she couldn't risk him discovering. Eric tried to convince himself it was just stress from her job, but his gut told him otherwise. One evening, he overheard Amanda on the phone, her voice soft and intimate. "I can't wait to see you again," she said, a hint of laughter in her tone. Eric froze in the hallway, the words hitting him like a punch to the chest. He stood there, heart pounding, debating whether to confront her. When Amanda ended the call and stepped out of the room, he asked, "Who were you talking to?" She barely missed a beat. "Just a friend from work," she said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're imagining things, Eric." Eric nodded but said nothing. Something wasn't right. The next day, he noticed a bouquet of roses sitting in Amanda's car. When he asked about them, she claimed they were from a patient's family. "A thank you gift," she explained casually, her tone light. But the unease gnawed at him. Over the next few weeks, Eric began noticing more signs. Amanda seemed to be putting extra care into her appearance, wearing makeup and perfume he hadn't seen in years. She'd leave the house earlier and come home later, often with vague explanations about her schedule. On more than one occasion, he caught her laughing at something on her phone, only to lock it the moment he walked into the room. Then there were the credit card statements. Charges for upscale restaurants and boutique hotels caught his eye. When he asked about them, Amanda brushed him off. "Work meetings," she said dismissively, but Eric's gut told him otherwise. One Friday evening, Amanda told him she was working late again. She kissed him on the cheek before walking out the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. As the front door closed, Eric grabbed his keys. He had decided to follow her. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he trailed her car through the quiet streets of Crescent Hill and into downtown Louisville. Amanda eventually parked outside a Trini restaurant. Eric parked a block away, his heart racing as he watched her greet a sharply dressed man. Their hug lingered too long to be friendly, and the way they laughed and leaned into each other told Eric everything he needed to know. He stayed in his truck, watching as they entered the restaurant together. The man, later identified as Dr. Matthew Grant, was someone Amanda had casually mentioned a few times, a colleague at the hospital. Now, seeing them together, Eric felt like a fool. He snapped a photo of them through the window, his hands trembling with anger, before driving home in a daze. That night, Eric barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amanda smiling at Grant, her hand brushing his arm. The next morning, Eric hired a private investigator. He needed to know the full story. The investigator confirmed Eric's fears within 2 weeks. Amanda and Grant had been seeing each other for months. They often met at upscale restaurants, booked hotel rooms for stolen afternoons, and even spent weekends away under the guise of work trips. The report included photos, receipts, and even text exchanges between them. It also revealed something that stung even more: Grant's reputation. The PI discovered he had a history of pursuing married women. Eric's rage simmered as he read the report over and over. How could Amanda do this to him? To their family? He confronted her one evening, showing her the photo he had taken. At first, she denied everything. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice rising with panic. But when Eric pressed harder, showing her the investigator's findings, she broke down. "I made a mistake," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But it's over now. I swear. I want to fix this." Eric didn't believe her. The trust between them had been shattered, and every attempt she made to reconcile felt hollow. He became consumed by the need for answers, searching through her belongings and keeping tabs on her every move. Despite Amanda's promises, Eric discovered more evidence. He found a second phone hidden in her gym bag, filled with explicit texts between her and Grant. One message, sent just days before, read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." When Eric confronted her again, Amanda's demeanor changed. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said coldly. "You've made this marriage unbearable." Their fights became constant, each one escalating into screaming matches that left both of them drained. Amanda eventually packed a bag and left, staying with a friend. Eric was left alone in their house, spiraling further into obsession. The life they had built together, the love they had once shared, felt like a distant memory. Eric couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. Fueled by anger and hurt, Eric started tracking Amanda's every move. He hacked into her email, checked her social media, and even followed her when she went out. One evening, he parked outside the friend's house where she was staying, watching as Amanda stepped out and got into her car. Eric followed her downtown again, this time to a luxury apartment complex. From his truck, he saw her meet Grant in the parking lot. They embraced before heading inside together. Eric sat there for hours, his anger building as he imagined what was happening inside. Back at home, Eric drank heavily, replaying the scene in his mind. His obsession began to take a darker turn. He started searching for ways to expose Grant, digging into his background and looking for dirt. He found old lawsuits, rumors of unethical behavior, and even a complaint from another woman at the hospital. But none of it felt like enough. Meanwhile, Amanda seemed to be moving on. She posted photos online, smiling and carefree, while Eric felt like his world was collapsing. The unfairness of it all consumed him. How could she be happy after everything she had done? The tension between them reached a boiling point one evening when Amanda returned to the house to pick up some of her belongings. Eric confronted her as soon as she walked through the door, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't even care, do you?" he shouted. "You've destroyed everything, and now you just walk away like it's nothing?" Amanda sighed. her patience clearly wearing thin. "Eric, this isn't healthy. For either of us. Just let me go." "You don't get to walk away from this," Eric said, his voice low and trembling. Amanda turned to leave, but Eric blocked her path. The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the empty house. Amanda's words hit like daggers. "You're nothing without me, Eric. You can't even keep this house together." Her words lingered in the air, cutting deeper than anything she had said before. Eric stood frozen, watching as Amanda walked out the door. The following weeks were a blur. Eric's obsession consumed him, his thoughts spiraling into darker territory. He felt like he had lost everything. His marriage, his family, his sense of self. Amanda had moved on, leaving him behind in the wreckage. The life they had built together was gone, replaced by bitterness, anger, and regret. The weeks after Amanda left were a blur for Eric. Every corner of their house reminded him of her, of the life they had built together, now crumbling before his eyes. Their once shared bedroom, the empty chair at the dining table, even her favorite coffee mug still sitting on the counter. They all felt like ghosts of the past, haunting him. Amanda had made it clear she wasn't coming back. She had sent divorce papers a few days after leaving, and Eric stared at them for hours, unable to bring himself to sign. It felt like an admission of defeat, a confirmation that their marriage was truly over. But Eric wasn't ready to let go. He couldn't shake the thought of Amanda cheating. The image of her with Dr. Matthew Grant, laughing, leaning close, taunted him day and night. What started as suspicion had grown into an all-consuming obsession, fueled by every text he uncovered and every whispered phone call he overheard. Eric spent hours poring over the investigator's report, rereading the texts between Amanda and Grant and replaying the images of them together in his mind. The thought of Amanda's lies consumed him, turning every waking moment into a spiral of anger and despair. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He started drinking more heavily, pouring himself whiskey the moment he got home from work. Nights turned into a haze of alcohol and obsessive thoughts about Amanda. He scoured her social media, searching for clues about her relationship with Grant. One evening, Eric noticed Amanda had posted a photo of herself at a cafe downtown, smiling with a group of friends. She looked happy, radiant, even, and it made Eric's blood boil. How could she smile like that after everything she had done? After cheating on him and tearing apart their family? Fueled by rage, Eric began driving past the places she frequented, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. One night, he saw her car parked outside the same luxury apartment complex he had followed her to before. The lights in the windows above were dim, but Eric sat in his truck for hours, imagining what was happening inside. The obsession was taking a toll on him. At work, his colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor and short temper. He missed deadlines, snapped at coworkers, and started making careless mistakes. His boss, a man who had once praised Eric for his dependability, pulled him aside one afternoon. "You've got to get it together, Eric," he said. "Whatever's going on at home, don't let it cost you your job." But Eric didn't care about his job anymore. His world had been Amanda, and without her, everything else felt meaningless. Amanda, meanwhile, was moving on with her life. She had started staying with Dr. Grant more frequently, and Eric suspected she was planning to move in with him permanently. The thought of her building a new life, happy and carefree, while he was left to pick up the pieces, ate away at him. One evening, Eric drove to the hospital where Amanda worked. He waited in the parking lot until he saw her walk out, her hair tied back and her nurse's badge clipped to her scrub top. For a moment, he considered approaching her, asking her to come back, to give their marriage one more chance. But then he saw Grant walk out behind her, his hand resting on her lower back as they walked to his car. Eric clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he watched them drive away together. The next day, Eric confronted Amanda outside her friend's house. She was loading groceries into her car when he pulled up, his truck screeching to a halt. "We need to talk," he said, stepping out. Amanda sighed, clearly exasperated. "Eric, this isn't the time." "You don't get to decide that," Eric snapped. "You tore our life apart, Amanda. You don't just get to walk away like it never happened." Her expression hardened. "I'm not doing this with you. You need to move on." I've made my decision. Eric's voice rose. Your decision? To throw away everything we had? For what? Him? Amanda closed her car door and turned to face him. I'm not going to apologize for wanting something better, Eric. You made this marriage unbearable. Her words stung, but what cut even deeper was the indifference in her tone. She wasn't angry or hurt, just done. You'll regret this, Eric said, his voice low and trembling. You'll regret everything. Amanda didn't respond. She got into her car and drove away, leaving Eric standing in the street, consumed by anger and humiliation. After that encounter, Eric's obsession turned darker. He began keeping a journal, writing down everything he knew about Grant. He listed his work schedule, his car's make and model, even the places he frequented for lunch. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with the information, but writing it down gave him a sense of control, however fleeting. Eric also started digging into Grant's background. He found old lawsuits against him, patients accusing him of negligence, though none had been proven. There were rumors of inappropriate behavior with female colleagues, whispers of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, but none of it felt like enough. Eric wanted something that would destroy Grant, something that would make Amanda see the mistake she had made. Meanwhile, Amanda was preparing to file for divorce formally. She sent a message through her attorney, requesting Eric sign the papers and let them move forward. When Eric read the email, his hands shook with rage. She had moved on so easily, as if their years together had meant nothing. The thought made Eric feel sick. One night, fueled by a mix of whiskey and desperation, Eric decided to confront Grant directly. He drove to the apartment complex and waited in the parking lot, watching as Grant's car pulled in. When Grant stepped out, Eric got out of his truck and approached him. We need to talk, Eric said, his voice steady but full of tension. Grant stopped, his expression calm but wary. Eric, I don't think this is a good idea. Eric stepped closer. You ruined my life. My family. Do you even care what you've done? Grant held his hands up defensively. Look, I'm not going to do this with you. I suggest you leave before this gets out of hand. Eric's fists clenched, but he didn't move. You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it? Grant turned and walked away, heading toward the building. Go home, Eric, he said over his shoulder. Eric stood there for a long time, seething. The encounter had done nothing to ease his anger. It had only made it worse. The following weeks were a blur of escalating obsession. Eric began driving by Grant's apartment daily, watching for any sign of Amanda. He collected receipts, photos, and anything he thought might help him piece together what they were planning. Friends and family started to notice the change in Eric. His best friend, Tom, tried to talk some sense into him one evening. You've got to let this go, man, Tom said. It's eating you alive. Amanda's not coming back. You need to accept that and move on. But Eric couldn't move on. He couldn't let go of the life they had shared, the plans they had made, or the love he had believed would last forever. In his mind, Amanda wasn't just leaving him, she was erasing him, replacing him with someone else as if he had never mattered. As the days passed, Eric's thoughts grew darker. He started searching online for ways to ruin Grant's reputation, looking for anything he could use to hurt him. He found message boards filled with advice on revenge, stories of people taking matters into their own hands. One search caught his eye, how to expose a cheating spouse. He clicked the link and began reading, his mind racing with possibilities. The obsession had taken over completely. Eric wasn't just fighting to save his marriage anymore. He was fighting to save himself from the void Amanda had left behind. And he didn't know how much longer he could hold himself back. Amanda had always been strong-willed, but in the weeks after she left Eric, her resolve hardened. Staying at her friend's house gave her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in months. She began focusing on rebuilding her life, separating herself from the arguments, the tension, and the resentment that had come to define her marriage. To Amanda, moving forward meant cutting ties with Eric completely. Her relationship with Dr. Grant had grown more serious, and while she avoided flaunting it publicly, she wasn't willing to keep it hidden forever. Grant was a source of comfort, offering her the kind of understanding and stability she felt had been missing in her marriage for years. Eric, meanwhile, was spiraling further into his obsession. The thought of Amanda building a new life without him felt unbearable. Every step she took toward independence felt like another reminder of his failure to keep their marriage intact. Late one night, Eric logged onto Amanda's social media accounts. He still had her passwords, though she hadn't thought to change them. He scrolled through her private messages, looking for evidence that would justify his anger. There were photos of her out with friends, messages planning future meetups, and even a few brief exchanges with Grant. Most of it was innocuous, but one message from Amanda to her sister caught Eric's eye. "I think it's time to move my things out for good. Grant is helping me look at apartments. I just want to move on." The words hit Eric like a hammer. She wasn't just leaving him, she was replacing him. His home, their memories, even the life they had built together. None of it mattered to her anymore. She had moved on so easily, as though he were a chapter she couldn't wait to close. Fueled by alcohol and frustration, Eric began drafting furious emails to Amanda. Some were long and rambling, recounting every wrong he believed she had done to him. Others were short and cutting, filled with accusations and anger. None of them felt like enough, so he deleted them all. The next day, Eric called his best friend, Tom, hoping for some kind of clarity. Tom had been one of the few people who had seen the cracks forming in Eric and Amanda's marriage long before the affair came to light. "You need to let it go, Eric," Tom said after listening to Eric rant about Grant. "Chasing her like this isn't going to fix anything. You've got to move on with your life." "Move on?" Eric snapped. "How do you move on from someone who lied to you, cheated on you, and destroyed everything you worked for?" Tom sighed. "I get it, man. It's hard. But you're torturing yourself. Amanda's not coming back, and no amount of anger is going to change that." Eric hung up without saying goodbye. Tom didn't understand. No one did. Amanda's distance only seemed to fuel Eric's determination. He continued driving by Grant's apartment, watching for any sign of her. He kept a journal, documenting her movements and piecing together what he thought was her plan. His thoughts grew darker with each passing day. For Amanda, the decision to leave wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. She had tried to make things work with Eric, but the relationship had become toxic, draining both of them emotionally. Grant's presence in her life had given her hope for a fresh start, and she wasn't going to let Eric's anger hold her back. Still, she knew the process wouldn't be smooth. She reached out to her attorney, hoping to expedite the divorce. "I just want to move forward," she told him during their meeting. "I don't want any more arguments or drawn-out fights. I'm done." Her attorney nodded sympathetically. "I'll make sure everything is handled as quickly as possible," he assured her. Amanda's sister, Lindsay, was also a source of support. Over coffee one morning, Amanda confided in her about the fear she felt whenever she had to interact with Eric. "He's not the man I married," Amanda said, stirring her latte absently. "It's like he's become someone else, obsessive, angry, unpredictable." Lindsay reached across the table and squeezed Amanda's hand. "You're doing the right thing by leaving, Amanda. He's not healthy to be around, and you deserve better." Despite the support, Amanda couldn't ignore the lingering fear that Eric might snap. She started double-checking her locks at night and avoiding places where she thought he might show up. But even with those precautions, she refused to let him control her life any longer. Meanwhile, Eric's obsession with Grant reached new heights. He began researching everything about the doctor, his education, his work history, even old articles and press releases about his career. Eric's search turned up some minor controversies, rumors about workplace affairs, and one patient lawsuit that had been dismissed years ago. Eric became fixated on these details, convinced they were evidence of Grant's unworthiness. In his mind, Amanda wasn't just leaving him. She was running toward a man who didn't deserve her. One evening, Eric drove to Grant's hospital, waiting in the parking lot for him to leave. When Grant emerged, Eric stepped out of his truck and blocked his path. "We need to talk," Eric said, his voice low and tense. Grant stopped, his expression calm but cautious. "Eric, I don't think this is the time or place." "You ruined my marriage," Eric spat. "You think you can just take my wife and get away with it?" Grant sighed, keeping his tone measured. "Amanda made her own decisions, Eric. I didn't take her from you. She chose to leave because your marriage wasn't working. You need to accept that." Eric's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Grant walked around him and got into his car, driving off without another word. The encounter left Eric seething. He drove home in silence, his thoughts racing. In his mind, Grant wasn't just another man. He was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in Eric's life. Amanda's visits to the house became increasingly rare. She only came by to collect a few belongings, always with someone else present to avoid being alone with Eric. On one occasion, she brought Lindsay with her, which infuriated Eric even more. "You can't even come here by yourself anymore?" Eric asked bitterly as Amanda packed up some boxes in the living room. "I don't trust you," Amanda replied bluntly. Her words stung, but Eric tried to mask his hurt with anger. "You're acting like I'm some kind of monster, Amanda, but you're the one who cheated. You're the one who lied." Amanda didn't respond. She simply finished packing her things and left, leaving Eric standing alone in the empty house. As the weeks passed, the tension between them showed no signs of easing. Amanda moved into Grant's apartment, officially starting a new chapter in her life. Eric, meanwhile, continued to spiral, his anger and obsession feeding off each other in a vicious cycle. One day, Eric received a notice from Amanda's attorney. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, and she was requesting sole custody of the house. The thought of losing not only his wife, but also the home they had shared pushed Eric to his breaking point. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, staring at the document in his hands. The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation, one that would shatter their lives forever. Eric sat in the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on him. It used to be a home, filled with laughter, warmth, and the constant hum of life. Now it was just walls and empty rooms, reminders of what he had lost. Divorce papers sat on the coffee table, staring back at him like a challenge he couldn't accept. Amanda had claimed the house in the proceedings, and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before he'd be forced to leave. In his mind, Amanda wasn't just walking away, she was erasing him. The woman who had promised to build a life with him was now moving on with someone else, leaving him with nothing but memories and regrets. She had made her decision, cutting him out like a chapter she no longer wanted to read. "You've made this marriage unbearable," Amanda had told him during one of their arguments. The words haunted him. How could she say that after everything they'd shared? After years of love, building a family, and creating a life together? Eric had tried to fight for their marriage, but Amanda had made it clear she was done. Her upcoming visit to collect the last of her things felt like the final nail in the coffin. Earlier that week, she had called to say she'd be stopping by Friday night. "I'll be quick," she had said, her voice distant. Eric spent the days leading up to her visit spiraling. He drank more than usual, drowning himself in whiskey and old photo albums. Every image of Amanda smiling, holding their kids, or standing next to him felt like a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. On Friday evening, Amanda arrived just after sunset. Eric sat by the window, watching as her car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, dressed casually, her expression neutral as she walked up to the front door. He watched her for a moment, trying to reconcile the woman outside with the Amanda he used to know. When she walked in, the tension in the air was palpable. "What do you even need from here anymore?" Eric asked, his voice sharp as she stepped inside. Amanda didn't respond right away. She slung her bag over her shoulder and sighed. "I told you. I'm just here for a few things I left in the closet." Eric followed her as she made her way toward the bedroom. "You've already taken everything else. What's left to take?" "Eric, I'm not doing this with you tonight," Amanda replied, her tone firm. "Let me grab my things, and I'll be gone." But Eric wasn't ready to let her go. "Not this time. Do you even care what you've done to me? To this family?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. Amanda stopped in her tracks and turned to face him. "I'm not the only one to blame for what happened, Eric. You pushed me away long before I met Grant." Hearing Grant's name was like a spark hitting dry tinder. "So this is my fault?" Eric shouted. "You cheated on me, Amanda. You tore this family apart, and now you're running off with him like none of it matters." "I'm done explaining myself to you," Amanda snapped, her voice cold. "You can't keep blaming me for everything. Take some responsibility for once in your life." The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the empty house. Amanda's words cut deep, each one hitting Eric like a blow. "You're nothing without me," Amanda spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You can't even hold this house together." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, the room was eerily still. Amanda stepped back, turning to leave, but her foot caught on the edge of the rug. She stumbled, her balance slipping as she fell backward. The sound of her body hitting the floor jolted Eric out of his haze. He froze, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he stared at her. Amanda lay motionless, her head tilted awkwardly against the carpet. "Amanda," he whispered, his voice trembling. He knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Amanda, get up, please." But she didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, Eric sat there, his mind racing. Panic surged through him, drowning out every rational thought. Finally, he stumbled to his feet and grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. When the 911 operator answered, Eric's words spilled out in a frantic rush. "It was an accident," he stammered. "We were arguing and she fell. Please, you have to send someone." The minutes that followed were a blur. Eric paced the living room, glancing at Amanda's still form every few seconds. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, and soon the house was awash in flashing red and blue lights. 2 officers entered the house, their faces stern as they surveyed the scene. Eric tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other as he recounted the argument and how Amanda had fallen. The officers listened silently, their expressions unreadable. "Step outside, sir," one of them said, gesturing toward the front door. Eric obeyed, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him. On the porch, Eric could hear the low murmur of voices inside as paramedics entered to check Amanda. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and front doors, their curiosity thinly veiled. Moments later, one of the paramedics emerged, his expression somber. Eric didn't need to hear the words to know what had happened. Amanda was gone. An officer approached him, her tone clipped but calm. "Eric Turner, you're under arrest," she said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Eric didn't resist. He felt numb as she read him his rights and led him to the waiting squad car. The last thing he saw before the door closed was the house, their house, now swarming with investigators. Inside, the police worked methodically, documenting the scene and collecting evidence. The disarray in the bedroom, the overturned rug, and the strained atmosphere painted a picture of a fight that had spiraled out of control. Neighbors later told investigators they had heard shouting earlier in the evening. "It was loud," one of them said. "I could hear them arguing even with the windows closed." Amanda's family, devastated by the news, came forward with their own concerns. Her sister, Lindsay, told police about Amanda's fears in the weeks leading up to her death. She said Eric was following her, showing up at places unannounced, Lindsay said. She was scared, but she didn't want to escalate things. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more troubling details about Eric's behavior. His phone contained unsent messages filled with anger and resentment toward Amanda. The journal he had kept was filled with notes about her movements and speculations about her relationship with Grant. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had been unraveling for months, consumed by anger and unable to let go. By the time Eric Turner's trial began, the case had become a media spectacle. Local news outlets covered every development, painting the story as one of love turned to obsession and rage. The tragic death of Amanda Turner, a respected nurse and beloved member of the community, had shaken Louisville to its core. Crescent Hill, a neighborhood once known for its charm and quiet streets, now bore the stain of a terrible crime. The prosecution wasted no time constructing their narrative. They argued that Eric's actions weren't an accident, but the culmination of months of anger, jealousy, and obsessive behavior. In their opening statements, they described Eric as a man unable to accept the end of his marriage, driven to lash out in a desperate attempt to regain control. The evidence painted a grim picture. Neighbors testified to hearing shouting and arguing from the Turner home on the night of Amanda's death. Amanda's sister, Lindsay, recounted how Amanda had expressed fear for her safety in the weeks leading up to the incident. "She told me she thought Eric was following her," Lindsay said tearfully on the stand. She didn't want to make things worse by getting the police involved, but I begged her to be careful. The prosecution also introduced Eric's journal into evidence. The entries, filled with notes about Amanda's movements and details about her relationship with Dr. Matthew Grant, painted a picture of a man consumed by obsession. The unsent texts on Eric's phone were equally damning, laced with anger and accusations that mirrored the arguments leading up to Amanda's death. But the most compelling piece of evidence was Eric's own 911 call. The jury listened intently as the recording played, hearing the panic in Eric's voice as he described Amanda's fall. While his words conveyed regret, the prosecution argued that his frantic tone was evidence of someone scrambling to cover up a deliberate act. On the stand, the lead investigator outlined the physical evidence from the scene. While they acknowledged Amanda's injuries were consistent with a fall, they pointed out inconsistencies in Eric's account. The overturned rug, the disarray in the room, and the positioning of Amanda's body all suggested a struggle. The defense faced an uphill battle. Eric's attorney argued that the incident was a tragic accident, the result of a heated argument that spiraled out of control. The attorney described Eric as a man who deeply loved his wife, but acted impulsively in a moment of emotional distress. They emphasized that what happened that night was not premeditated, but rather a terrible and unfortunate mistake. They called on friends and colleagues to testify about Eric's character. Several described him as a hardworking, kind-hearted man who had always put his family first. Eric was devastated when he found out about Amanda's affair, one coworker said. He wasn't himself, but he's not the kind of person who would ever intentionally hurt someone. The defense also argued that Amanda's affair with Dr. Grant had been a catalyst for Eric's emotional turmoil. They framed her relationship with Grant as a betrayal that had pushed Eric to the brink, emphasizing the pain he felt watching Amanda move on so easily. But the prosecution countered by bringing Dr. Matthew Grant to the stand. Dressed in a sharp suit, Grant maintained his composure as he described his relationship with Amanda. "She was unhappy in her marriage," Grant said. "She told me she tried to make it work, but Eric's behavior became increasingly controlling." Under cross-examination, the defense attempted to paint Grant as manipulative, questioning his past relationships and professional ethics. "Isn't it true that you've been involved with other married women before?" Eric's attorney asked pointedly. Grant hesitated but admitted, "I've made mistakes in the past, but my relationship with Amanda was genuine. I cared about her deeply." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but the prosecution steered the focus back to Eric's actions. "This trial isn't about Dr. Grant," the prosecutor reminded the jury. "It's about Eric Turner and the choices he made that led to Amanda's death." As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. Amanda's family sat stoically in the front row, their grief etched into their faces. Eric, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his frame, rarely looked up from the table. In a surprising move, Eric chose to testify in his own defense. Taking the stand, he spoke in a low, trembling voice, recounting his version of events. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Eric said, his eyes welling with tears. "I loved Amanda. I still do. We argued that night, and things got out of hand. I didn't mean to hurt her." Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed him on his behavior leading up to Amanda's death. "You kept a journal tracking her movements, didn't you?" the prosecutor asked. "You followed her, you sent her angry messages, and you confronted Dr. Grant multiple times. Is that the behavior of someone who had no intention of escalating things?" Eric struggled to answer, his voice faltering. "I was hurt," he said finally. "I didn't know how to handle it, but I didn't mean to hurt her. It was an accident." After weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. The deliberations stretched over 3 days, with both sides anxiously awaiting the verdict. Amanda's family held hands, silently praying for justice, while Eric sat alone, staring blankly ahead. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood, unfolding the piece of paper that held Eric's fate. The foreperson announced the decision, stating that Eric was legally accountable for the events leading to Amanda's tragic end. The courtroom fell silent as the words echoed, bringing a sense of finality to weeks of emotional testimony. Amanda's sister, Lindsay, broke down in tears, while Eric slumped in his seat, his face pale. At the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed the courtroom solemnly. "This case is a tragedy on all fronts," he said. "Two lives have been destroyed, and a family has been irreparably broken. Mr. Turner, your actions that night were reckless and inexcusable, but the court recognizes the complexity of the circumstances." Eric was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As he was led away in handcuffs, Eric turned to address Amanda's family. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to capture reactions. Amanda's sister spoke briefly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "No sentence will bring Amanda back," Lindsay said. "But I hope this verdict brings some measure of justice for her and serves as a reminder that such domestic conflicts have no place in our society." The house where it had all happened was sold later that year, its new owners unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. For those who knew the Turners, the story became a somber cautionary tale, a reminder of how love, when poisoned by anger and obsession, could lead to devastating consequences. In the quiet streets of Crescent Hill, the Turners' story lingered like a shadow. Neighbors still spoke in hushed tones about the couple who had seemed so perfect on the outside, but had been hiding cracks no one could see. For Eric, the years in prison offered little solace. He replayed that night in his mind endlessly, searching for the moment when he could have stopped it all from spiraling out of control. And for Amanda's family, the loss remained a wound that never fully healed. They visited her grave often, leaving fresh flowers and whispering words they wished they could have said while she was still alive. The tragedy of Amanda Turner was not just a story about love gone wrong. It was a story about the consequences of unchecked emotions and the devastating cost of letting anger take control.